Right? There we are. So chapter 9 is wording your speech. Once again, I'm going to move through the chapter at a pretty good rate. You obviously should have read this chapter, so most of it should be familiar to you. And if any of it you want to discuss, feel free to jump in and let me know. But so chapter 9 is all about wording your speech. Okay, so we talked about starting out, opening your speech, closing your speech a little bit. Now let's talk about the actual words that we use in the speech. Now, in this particular chapter, the authors open up with discussion on oral presentation or orality. Oral presentation in a speech is really important, and it has to do with something about what essentially turns out to be the way we speak as human beings is very unique. There's something really special about the way we communicate to each other in the real world, face to face, so to say. So there are several functions of language that they note here in the introduction. They talk about a language being referential, language being relational, and language being symbolic. Now, does that make any sense to you is the question. And when we speak about language being referential, language points to something concrete, something specific, something that we can point to, sort of say, and focus on. And a language that is being spoken live in front of somebody, that's what it does. It creates a point of reference. And it is relational, and that's what makes speeches, live speeches, real speeches, powerful, because we are actually engaging in a relationship with each other. When a speaker speaks and listeners listen, they enter into a relationship. It's a transaction, sort of say. And the other thing about language that it's symbolic. It is disconnected from the real world that we live in. A lot of times we speak to each other in a roundabout way. Let's put it that way. We speak to each other in ways which are less concrete, and by doing so, we're using a very beautiful part of what human language is, speaking in symbols and concepts. And sometimes we can get further with that, and sometimes not. But using this type of power of oral language is exactly what makes speeches, very effective and really unusual ways of communicating. So the authors open up this chapter by talking about an oral style, written style and oral style, really two different types of styles. And they note that the oral style is informal. It's like a conversation. And the written style is formal. When you write your speech, and this is why I don't recommend people writing their speeches. When you write your speech, the way you write is differently from the way you talk, hopefully. Some people write just the way they talk. And some, and to me, I find that sometimes disheartening because I hear, I read someone's paper that they wrote, and I could hear them talking. It's almost as if they are talking. But most people are supposed to have a very different style that's oral from a style that's written. A written style is much more complicated. A written style is much more formal. It's much more precise. He uses more elaborate ways of explaining things, where oral style is very simple, very down to earth, very easy to connect with. And so by delivering a speech, what we have to do is we have to realize that we are delivering this as a speech, not as a letter. So when you sit down and write out your speech, it will come out a certain way. But when you actually deliver your speech, it should come out differently. And this is where the problem lies, is that people who write out their speech then try to read it, it does not sound good. This is the problem. That's why I tell people never write out your speech, write on an outline. I mean, you can write your notes and things like that and then forget them. The reason why you're writing them out is so that you can get the thoughts out of your head. You're not writing them out because you're actually going to read them. Because if you read them, it will be a very boring speech, and most people can tell you're reading, because the feeling, the emotion, the sort of say thrust with which you deliver those words is going to be completely different if you're reading versus you are delivering it just from your mind. Now, some people are talented. They can take those notes and they can actually write them the way they would say them. And so in that case, obviously it's different. But most people like that don't really need those notes. So look at the differences between a written style and an oral style in our textbook here. On page 138, the written style says, remit the requested amount forthwith. The oral style, pay your bill. Now, both sentences say the same, but nobody in their right mind says remit the requested amount forthwith. Now, you can write that in a bill collection letter or something like that, but you cannot come up to your friends, or have people in a restaurant, write that on somebody's bill that they have to pay. Remit the requested amount forthwith. They're going to laugh at you like, what in the world is that? So it makes no sense. It's way too formal, way too formal. So a lot of times what we have to do is we have to simplify things in speech. We can say things in a very complicated way in writing, but in speaking, to do the same actually doesn't work. It makes it sound really weird, really strange. So writing out your speech is a good idea to get your thoughts out, but don't plan on reading it for that very reason, because most people's written style is quite different from their oral style, and you don't want to create the feeling that you're reading your speech. So in that sense, focus on your outline rather than that. All right, so that's something that we have to understand about oral delivery of our speeches. They follow a very simple vocabulary. There's not a lot that we put into that vocabulary when we speak. So something that the authors highlight here is kind of quite important, so I want to direct your attention to it. On page 139 at the bottom, they talk about 3 fundamental qualities that help you develop a clear and effective oral style. So here you are delivering your speech. Well, these are the things that you need to focus on as you think of how you're going to say things and how you're going to phrase things and what you're going to say. And these 3 effective sort of say features of your style are accuracy, simplicity, and restatement. And then, of course, they go on to explain what those are on pages 140 and on. So when we say accuracy, accuracy is very important. You can't just pick any word to say whatever it is that you want to say. You have to pick the right words to say it. And oral language is concrete and specific. So you have to be very specific of what you're trying to say. Otherwise, people will not understand you. And because words are symbols, those symbols are not the same to everyone. Each one of us understands a symbolic world, but each one of us sees those symbols in their own way. So if I mention something to you, it is only an idea, and the way you visualize that idea is different, okay? We might have done this exercise with you. I don't know. I do this in a lot of my communication classes where I ask people to visualize something. So how about this? Visualize a car. Do you see a car? Can you imagine it? Can you imagine the details? all the features, the color, the style, the shape. Now imagine the surroundings of that car. Where is it located? Do you see the rest of the picture? If you have good imagination, you probably just imagine some sort of a car. And the question is, what kind of a car did you imagine? Every single person is going to imagine a different car. Well, one person would think of a, some vintage Ford truck or something like that. Another person will think of a black Hummer. Another person would think of a, Infiniti SUV that's all white and shiny or something. Or somebody's going to think of a Tesla. They're all going to be different cars, is what I'm trying to say. Whatever you think of a car, that's the one you're going to imagine, whatever your mind says. Because I didn't tell you what car to imagine. I didn't tell you what color. I didn't tell you what shape. I didn't tell you what brand, what make, how old, how new. Didn't give you any of those details. In fact, I didn't even tell you where that car is. I didn't tell you imagine a car in the garage. I just said imagine a car. If you imagine it inside a garage, that's what you imagined. If you imagined this a racing car on a racetrack, that's what you imagined. It all depends on what your mind is telling you. And this is what we mean when we say that the words are symbols. I say car, you say whatever it is that your mind says the car is supposed to be. So and many times our communication is a bit imprecise because those words, they really are representatives of ideas and symbols that we hold in our mind. Sometimes they match, sometimes they don't match with the audience that you have. So in that sense, you have to be accurate. If you're talking about a car, don't just say a car, because that's going to mean a lot of different things to people. Say what kind of car, describe it, be more specific, and then people can track with you. Now they know exactly what you mean by a car, or which car you're talking about. If it's important to your point, if it's important to your illustration, let's say. Avoid vagueness and misrepresentation. So there are some words that can have various aspects of meaning. Okay, they can be understood one way, they can be understood in another way. Use the words that are not vague. Use the words that convey the idea clearly. In fact, use some synonyms to communicate clarity. There's nothing wrong with that, of restating something and using a synonymous word that would help you understand what it is that you're describing and what it is that you want me to see about that particular object you're describing. And so accuracy is using the best words possible and the clearest way to express the meaning of what you're trying to convey. So being accurate is a pretty important skill when it comes to delivering speeches. If you're too generic in your words, people will usually lose attention, or they might imagine something that you really don't want them to imagine, because that's not what you're talking about. But their imagination will take them there. So you have to leave some room for imagination, but do give them some details and be specific. Now, simplicity is a great tool for speaking. A lot of times when we speak, people are tempted to use big words that they rarely use themselves in everyday life. And they'll use, these big important words to make everybody feel that they're smart, that they know what they're talking about. Or if you use the word that nobody else knows, then everybody's impressed. They're like, wow, I don't know what that word means. Guess what? It could be impressive to some people, but it doesn't help you move your point along. They have no idea what you're talking about. So what if, instead of using the big impressive word, you use a simple word that explains that? You get your goal of people understanding you, even though you didn't impress them so much. So simplicity, the authors say, does not mean simplistic. You're not trying to talk to your audience as if they're 5-year-olds. You're just simply choosing the words which are clear and simple and precise, rather than, you know, something that they wouldn't be able to follow. So it's not about, you know, it is about being precise, but that's what really when we mean when we say simplicity. All right, restatement is the third technique that you can use to achieve a certain level of clarity in your audience. And restatement is when you repeat things. Restatement is when you take an idea and you state it one way, and then you state it in another way, the same exact idea. You just find different words to express that same concept. And so a lot of times, depending on the phrasing you use, listeners will connect with it better, or, you know, to a lesser degree. It depends. But restating an idea a number of times basically makes sure that your listeners will track with you, because you state it and then you restate it in a slightly different way. And as you redefine that concept clarifies for them in their mind. If they are not 100% with you, let's say they are getting, you know, 80% of what you're saying, by restating the idea, you're bumping that number up. Okay, you're making it more effective, because now you gave them another reference point of how to understand that phrase, that term, that sentence. You gave them another way of looking at it. And so by restating, you're actually clarifying. So in a sense, it's connected to the idea of accuracy and simplicity in a very tangible way. All right, so these are the features of oral style, you know, that are really important to understand. Now, a lot of times, these are the same features we want to use in our written style, but we can get away with a lot more in a written style than we do in the oral style. Okay, so the next section of the chapter talks about using language strategically. Okay, and by strategically, what we mean is you have an objective, you have a strategy, you have a goal. Your goal is to deliver a speech and be understood. So you might have to use certain words, certain ways of using words to achieve your given strategy. That is your strategy, to create an understanding. So, and the three strategic common language, sort of say, moves that the authors present here is definitions, imagery, and metaphor. You can use these in your presentation, your speech, to create a greater traction with you and your audience. So let's say that your audience understands most of what you're saying, but there's some things that you're talking about that are unfamiliar to them. Maybe they're a little technical. Maybe they don't know those terms, or maybe they've never experienced that before. And so because precision is important, because you want to be understood exactly what you mean, you might have to use definitions. And you might have to use a dictionary definition. There's nothing wrong with using dictionary definition. It's fine. Only that sometimes I find that dictionary definitions are not clear themselves. So they can bring actually more confusion than solve things. So an alternative to a dictionary definition, and that means just looking up a word and say, okay, when I say this, I mean this. You know, this is what we call stipulative definition. When I say, you know, music, I mean rap music or something like that, you know, because we can be talking about music and everybody, and because music is such a broad thing, you know, one person is thinking classical, another person is thinking salsa, you know, another person is thinking jazz. And what I really am talking about is rap. And some people would say, well, rap is not music at all. So you see, that's the problem that we have. The problem is that I'm not precise enough, I'm not clear enough, I'm not accurate enough in my definitions. So I'm going to define to people, what do I mean by music? Now, for the purpose of my speech, for the purpose of my presentation, the music that I mean is this. So whatever they may be. So This is what we call a stipulative definition, where you stipulate what that word means, meaning how you use it specifically. That's different from a dictionary definition, because dictionary definition will be generic. Now, you can also use something called a negative definition. All right. Negative definitions are really good when you're trying to draw a contrast, when you're trying to say, when I say such and such word, I do not mean this and that. And why would you use a negative definition? Well, negative definitions are good when you know your audience is thinking of those things, or potentially thinking of those things in that particular way. So you just want to clarify, when I talk about this, this is what I mean, and I don't mean this and this and this and that. So that just automatically excludes those possibilities for people. And all of a sudden, people clear away their misconceptions, because maybe they will take your phrase, take your words, take your sentence that you have created, and try to construe it in some way that you didn't mean it. So what you're doing is you're preventing that. You're preventing that mistake by saying, this is not how I mean it. The way I mean it is like this. So you're sort of saying, saving that situation by clarifying your definition. Now, there's also an etymological definition. Sometimes you can play on the etymology of the word, and etymology is how the word is formed, where it comes from, basically. So you can take a word and break it down and tell people, all right, this is what I mean. I'm using this term in the true sense of what it really means, and this is how the word breaks down, and that's what I mean by it. That's it's a common thing. So let me see if I can give you an example. A lot of times, I teach courses. I teach courses in biblical studies. That's my narrow specialty. So I will use the word apocalypse, for example, and people say, "Oh, apocalypse, apocalypse," and they're thinking a million things that are come up in their head. Apocalypse, they think of some zombie apocalypse movie or something they've seen, or they see some movie about the end of the world, the nuclear apocalypse or whatever. And I have to tell my students, it says, when I use the word apocalypse, this is not how I use this word. This is what I mean by apocalypse. By apocalypse, I mean a type of literature that talks about something hidden being made known and revealing something that may not be seen with our own eyes. So kind of like a secret becoming known, and this is a mystery becoming no longer a mystery. That's how I use the word apocalypse, because that's what it really means in Greek. So I know that's not the popular definition of the word. Most people think that means the end of the world, but that's not what it means. And so this is how I use the word apocalypse, because in my industry, it means something very specific. So you can go into the etymology of that word and say, this is what it means, this is where it comes from, and this is how I'm using this word. One of the best ways to define something is what we call an exemplar definition, which is what I just did for you by explaining an etymology. When I needed to explain what etymology is, I just took the word apocalypse. And what I did is I gave you an example of how I would use etymology. That's an exemplar definition. You probably notice that a lot of times in this class, I give you exemplar definitions. I talk about the concept and idea, and then I draw a little scenario, a little illustration, and give you a little example of how that works in real life. Let's put it that way. And so sometimes I come up with it on the fly. Sometimes I just, draw from my experience and knowledge. That depends. Every time I teach this course, it's a little bit different. But basically, that's what I do. I use examples, and that's an exemplar definition. It's where you tell your listeners some sort of a story that illustrates what it is that you mean by that particular word or an idea or a concept that you're trying to express. And then the last definition is the contextual definition, and that means that you're using contextual definition is when you're using this word in this particular context this way, where in other contexts it would mean something else. Okay, so that's the idea. It's very narrow definition, but it has to do with very specific context in which you are. All right, so analogical definition is another possibility of you explaining something. If you're trying to be clear and you're trying to explain something that people don't understand, you can always compare it to something. An analogy is when you're taking something and comparing it with something else. Drawing an analogy is using two examples of something not necessarily similar, but focusing on that which makes them similar, essentially. And so that's an analogy. Analogy is never perfect. You can't always put an equal sign to it and say this means this. That's not how analogy works. Analogy is only true in some way, in some shape, in some form, but never really truly fully 100% corresponding to the idea. So an analogy is a good way to define something. And if you can use a story, an example, that's good, but analogy works really well. This is like that, you know, that's what you're trying to say, you know. So that's one way to clarify your ideas as you're speaking, using definitions. And definitions can be very powerful. Another way is imagery. How many of you have, you know, relied on imagery or used an imagery? Have you ever given a speech where you had to rely on imagery? Have you ever tried something like that? Can you give me an example of imagery you would use in a speech? You know, just kind of throw out a scenario for me. Anybody?
One question. Imagery means that like impressions or memory or situation that you have lived before, and you explain them to the.
It could be something that you have seen or something that you have heard. It could be something that you've tasted.
Okay.
That's imagery. Imagery is some sort of an object that demonstrates a sense, a sensation, a feeling of some sort that you've had, okay? And that object, that imagery, whatever that item, can bring back that sense, that feeling, that understanding that you have had at some point. Does that make sense?
It's like it's like experience that you have like or feelings that bring up something that you lived before.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it could be something visual, but it doesn't have to be visual. A lot of times when we hear word imagery, we think of an image, which would be like the easiest thing is like a photograph or something like, or a picture or drawing. Most of us are stimulated by those things to, you know, understand something, you know, draw a picture, and then everybody's like, oh, that's what you're talking about. So, but it doesn't always work as a, you know, it doesn't have to be a image like a picture. It could be a sound that draws your attention. I could say that, hey, you know, my head hurts, and you could say, well, how does it hurt? I said it hurts as if you put it inside of a big church bell and then you rang the bell. You know, what I just did is I used an auditory image. You know what a church bell sounds like. If you've ever been next to one or heard one, and it sounds like, and it vibrates, you feel it, and everything just kind of, and I can say, okay, that's how my head hurts. All of a sudden, you're feeling my pain in a very vivid way because now you can imagine what my head feels like. And I'm using not a visual imagery, because seeing the church bell is not going to help you. It's hearing it sound, and especially being close to it. and you feel the whole room vibrate, the whole surface vibrate. You feel the sound vibrations coming at you because that's how loud that noise is. And so all of a sudden you're like that. Or I could say, that I felt like I was at home and it was a stormy night, and all of a sudden I felt a sound that sounded like a train was coming through my backyard or something like that. Now, you would immediately know that I'm talking about some sort of a, huge storm or hurricane or some sort of a tornado or something like that, because it's a violent sound, very loud, very disturbing, a train going through my backyard. Now, if you've heard a train before, you know how loud it sounds, how it clinks and clanks and moves and shakes and squeals on the brakes and all of that. All of a sudden, you have a very vivid image pop into your mind, and it's in your mind because you've heard it before. And what I used here particularly an example of auditory imagery to help you understand what I felt or what I experienced at the moment, when there was a storm in my backyard or something like that. So hopefully that makes sense. This is what I mean when I say imagery. Visual imagery is the easiest one. Okay, we all use visual imagery. We all should use visual imagery when we speak. You can use visual aids when you speak. A lot of times, if I speak on the topic, I will pick up an item that will help me make my point. Okay, I would say, who doesn't like clean water? And I'll hold up a water glass or something like that, and I'll sometimes basically demonstrate, right, as I'm speaking, something that I want to say. And holding a bottle of water in front of people's eyes is going to make them thirsty. So that's something like that. It's an imagery. Now I am actually employing what is called gastatory imagery. I can do this, and I can say, that tastes so good. And you know exactly what I feel. Why? Because you've tasted cold, refreshing water before in your life. You know what it feels like. I'm using gastatory imagery, a sensation, a feeling that you're familiar with because you've tasted that before. You know what it tastes like. And that is, again, how you can communicate to your audience, describing feelings and sensations with this type of, stimulation, visual stimulation. Olfactory imagery, fancy word perhaps you don't know, has to do with how things smell. You can use the sensations of smell to paint an image for your audience. Now, you got to be careful with that because you have to make sure that the people know what you're describing. So you have to use common smells. People have to understand them. Sometimes you might be able to speak about how something smells, and it's something that people have never smelled before, and that would be very hard for them to imagine. But if you use the right image, that they can identify with, to draw a picture for them, in their mind, they will almost smell it. They would smell the smell you're talking about, basically, if you're vivid enough to explain it to them. That's a way of, again, communicating clearly by using, in this case, an olfactory, a smell sense image. There's tactile imagery. Okay. Tactile imagery is when you taste, when you sense something with your, with your body. It could be like a pressure or a sensation, like sandpaper or something like that. I don't know, sand in your shoes, or things like that. It could be different senses, essentially, that you feel on your body, on your skin, perhaps. And that's That's tactile imagery. You can do that. You can talk about something being round like a ball. Everyone has touched a ball in their life, you know. And so if I say his head was round like a ball, it's like a basketball, or more like a pumpkin perhaps, because it was misshapen and had some ridges, and so all of a sudden now you're visualizing somebody's round head, and I'm describing it, and I'm using round objects, and I'm talking about its shape, and all of a sudden you know exactly what I mean. Or I can talk about, you know, her hand was cold as ice. I almost had to hold myself back because I realized that if I held my hand much longer, I would feel the chill run up my spine. That's me using an imagery of tactile energy, you know, talking about feelings and senses that we sense, and shapes and sizes of things. Okay, so that's the idea. Kinesthetic energy is another energy that has to do with movement and muscles, you know, feeling things inside your body. And then there's organic imagery also. Organic imagery has to do with senses of like hunger or nausea or something like that. It's another feelings of or sensations out there. When you feel like your head, the whole room is spinning or something like that, you're about to pass out. So that's an organic imagery. So there's a number of different types of imagery that you can use. Maybe this is even longer and fancier list that there needs to be, but I think you get the idea. You can describe things in a very precise way by relying on these types of imagery. And if you do a good job describing it, people would feel what you felt or whatever you want them to feel, because in a sense you are creating the mood, you are creating the impression. So, but for different people, they respond to different types of imagery. Some people are more prone to visual, other people's are most to maybe auditory. So that depends. All right, another way of being clear about what it is that you're trying to describe is to use a metaphor. I don't know, sometimes metaphor is not very clear, but it could be used to clarify things, okay? What is a metaphor? Metaphor is when you compare two things that are really not the same. So can you think of an example of a metaphor for me? Anybody? Just think of a metaphor. What are some of the common metaphors we use in life all the time? Okay. Anybody?
Metaphors. I think that metaphors are like examples or expectations that let's say you're talking about music, but you know that somebody is playing music in a good way. So you say that that person is similar to another famous musician in the way it plays. So that's like a metaphor. It's an hypothetical explanation, let's say.
Yeah, that is using two things that are not the same to compare them. You are comparing two things that are not like each other with each other. Like if I say, you know, Mozart is like ice cream to me. You know, Mozart is not ice cream, right? But if I say he's like ice cream to me, what am I saying? I'm saying I like it. It's like a dessert, you know? You're comparing things, essentially. So you got some metaphors for me.
I don't know, but one that I use a lot is, well, do we have to always compare, or, well, I don't know. I'm gonna tell you one, because when I have to wait too much for something, I usually say, hey, I have to wait like 100 hours there. And it's like, I don't know if that would apply, but or that it's gonna be
That's called an exaggeration, which is fine.
yeah. But I was thinking, I think I confused it a little bit, because there's always something that it's called
What if you say
hyperbole,
this?
or
Yeah, hyperbole. Yes, hyperbole. What if you say something like this? The weight is deadly here. Like you just walk into a room and there's a big long line. You say the weight is deadly here. What you're saying is that the line is so long, I think I'm gonna die.
okay. Yeah, it's an exaggeration too, but in another way, right?
It's a metaphor. Waiting in line is not the same thing as dying. But what you're doing is you're saying, I feel like I'm gonna die. This is so awful. This is so terrible. I don't want to do this. I'm looking forward to waiting in line like I'm looking forward to dying, which I'm not looking forward to. And that's essentially what you're saying. So there's metaphors, your hands are cold like ice or something like that, or you can say, you are such a fox. If I say you are such a fox, what am I saying? Now I'm crossing cultural lines now, because different cultures actually define that one different.
Yeah. It might not be good in my country, but I don't know.
That's why I gotta know.
But what's your point with that one?
Well, in different cultures and different languages, animals have certain imagery. Like there's good animals, there's bad animals. Like
yeah, it's the same.
If you want to call somebody something, you would use a different animal per se to draw it on their character. Now that person is not that animal, but you're comparing them to an animal. And so when I say somebody is a fox, in the Western culture, that means that they're crafty, they're sneaky, they're conniving, they're calculating, they're going to come up with something. And there's another colloquial meaning of the word fox, which means somebody very, attractive. Or so there's a slang term for that too. So sometimes people would say foxy lady or something like that, which is essentially means the same as the sexy lady, foxy lady, or she's so foxy, people would say, so that means different things in different languages, and different animals have different characters. So just for fun, in your culture where you come from, if you really wanted to insult somebody, what animal would you call them? Give me one.
Fox.
A fox. See.
Yeah,
that's a very
that one.
connotation.
Or, for example, for men, it's like you're a dog. Also.
A dog?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. A dog. So dog is a negative thing. Okay, good.
Yeah, because it's exactly. It's like a negative.
Because of how the dog behave. Okay, so in America, if people want to make fun of somebody, or like let's say if they're sloppy, what do you say about them? They're messy. You say you're a pig.
Yeah, that's what you're a pig. That's very useful in my country too.
Yeah, so in some countries, and some cultural things like that, you're a pig. When I say you're a pig, I don't mean you're a pig. I mean you're messy. And that's a metaphor. That's exactly what, metaphors are. So we can use metaphors, and they are very powerful. Again, because if we share that same cultural understanding of what that image means, then we can highlight really, really closely to people a negative emotion or a positive emotion, a good feeling or a bad feeling, a sense of, discontent or sickness or disgust. We can communicate all of that by using a metaphor sometimes. And so, but you have to be careful, because you really have to know if your audience is on the same, playing field where you are, because many of those things are so cultural, they don't always translate from culture to culture. All right, so good. I just hopefully now you'll remember what metaphors are. We all use them. We use them all the time. It's just a lot of times we can't put our finger on it. All right. The next section I'm going to highlight, rather quickly here. Choosing a rhetorical frame. What in the world is a rhetorical frame? Rhetorical frame is how you choose to be connected and affiliated with your audience. Like, what is the approach that you're going to take? And there's two primary approaches that the authors present to us in this book, and that's a valuative frame and a narrative frame. So basically, if you're going to appeal to your audience, are you going to appeal to a common value that you're connected with? Okay. Value is something that you believe to be proper or improper. Let's put it this way. Like taking care of, grandma who needs help. If you believe that that's the right thing to do, well, then I'm going to appeal to that value of taking care of somebody who needs help and they're elderly and they can't help it. So I know that I share that value with you, so I'm going to use that value, and I'm going to use that as the framework to build on. If you take care of your grandma, and well, what about taking care of somebody else's grandma? Wouldn't that be right? Because she is somebody's grandma. So all of a sudden now you feel bad for some old lady that doesn't have anybody to take care of her. So all of a sudden you feel that connection. Why? Because I touched on a value. You actually believe in something. You actually embrace this ideal. And so I can focus on that ideal and build on it. Okay. And the other aspect is another frame is the narrative frame. Narrative frame is when you tell a story and you move a person in a bit more emotional way, essentially. And you still get your point across. But instead of me, if I want to ask you for a donation to a charity that helps, old people who don't have anybody to care for them, I can appeal to your value of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves, like a grandparent or something like that. Or I could tell you a story about a sad grandma that's got nobody coming to her house and she's sitting all by herself and, missing the world and feeling sorry or something. I don't know. I can come up with some sort of a sad story, I'm sure. And as I do that, you're going to feel bad for her, and that bad feeling is going to motivate you to donate to my charity, because now I'm going to ask you to help me out because I'm going to make her day, basically. And so by me telling you the sad story, I use the narrative to basically make the same type of appeal, to make the same exact point. So if I don't know that I share that same value with you, at least I can communicate it this way. So there's a number of ways in which you can approach your audience. But people are, in a sense of people, you have to be able to find a proper way to connect with them. All right, so the next section here talks about creating an atmosphere. An atmosphere, well, obviously it's important. Whenever you're speaking, you need to understand where you're speaking. Is it a business setting or is it an academic setting? What is your setting? And you get the chance to control the atmosphere. You can set the tone. You can make it respectful. You can make it disrespectful. You can make it formal. You can make it informal, because you're the speaker. You set the terms. You set the rules. And you can adjust the intensity of your speech. You can use the vocabulary in your speech to create a certain sense of an atmosphere, an aura that you basically want people to be involved in. So how you speak, the words you say, but also the manner in which you speak, how reserved you are or how animated you are, will create an atmosphere. If you're really excited and jumpy, and it's one thing. If you are very reserved or more toned down, that's a whole different thing. So how you're going to do that depends on you as a speaker, and it has to do with the occasion and whatever your speech is. So all right, now conversation about intensity. You can use intensity in your speech. There are some words that are emotionally charged. They have certain force to them. And you can use those words to basically create a sense of Intensity. There's a few examples over here that people have. I don't know if they're really good examples or not, but on page 147, there's a few examples that kind of give you an idea of how you can have a very positive term, and you can have a neutral term, and you can have a very negative term for the same exact concept or idea, or basically an object or something like that, or a person. So you can say student athlete, or you can say basketball player, or you can say freeloader. So whatever that means to different people. So if I want to create a negative feeling, then I will, or I wouldn't even say a freeloader. I would say something like a jock or something like that. Student athlete, that's a very positive thing. Basketball player, okay, well, it's just kind of a neutral thing. So he plays basketball. If I say a jock, well, that's a diminutive term. It just means somebody who's not very smart, and all they've got to show for themselves is muscles. They're skilled in a sport, but other than that, they're not a great person or anything like that. So that's very diminutive term. Where when I say student athlete, it's a very good thing. So you can use these words, and the intensity which you choose in your language will communicate how you feel about the subject and what emotion you want to convey. So if you want to go really negative, then obviously you go for the negative words, and you may not even realize it because you feel negatively about it. You will use terms that are more negative. This is where the conversational appropriateness is appropriate. Essentially, there are certain language that's formal and informal. Sometimes people get up and they speak, and I heard people use a lot of slang because that's how they speak. They don't really know how else to speak because that's their oral style, is using a lot of slang. Now, in some situations it's fine, in other situations it's not. Usually delivering your speech, you want to use the language that's appropriate for the audience. Now, if you're speaking in front of people who are like that and they would use slang, then perhaps using some slang is a good idea. But if you're speaking in front of people who are, in a different category, then maybe you shouldn't use slang like that. And that's again, you have to be the judge of what's appropriate for the situation. Now, there's several other types of language that the authors here propose. They propose a gender-neutral language, and that's a tough one for a lot of people to achieve, because if you come from a society that is, let's say, masculine-oriented society, then it's very hard to use a gender-neutral language because people all around you do not use gender-neutral language. When I say gender-neutral language, does that make sense to you guys? Do you understand what I'm talking about? Does that ring a bell? Does that mean anything to you when I say gender-neutral language? Or do you want me to go and explain it more? Go ahead. Either one of you.
Yes, for me, gender-neutral language is when you don't discriminate. You don't discriminate, like describing if you speak as well for women or men. You don't discriminate which of them you are.
Right.
Or even if you are or you consider that as something else.
Yes, you're right. It is a language that's in a sense discriminatory, but a lot of times it has to do with our society, with our culture, with our language. What are the common words that we use in our in our society? I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm going to say a profession, and you're going to tell me if you're visualizing a man or a woman. Soldier. You're visualizing a man or a woman, just in your mind. Most people will visualize a man because that's traditionally what soldiers are. Very rarely you think of a soldier woman, and of course that happens all the time. There's lots of women who serve in the military. How about pilot? Almost everyone is going to visualize a man. Why? Again, a common profession dominated by males, things like that. So, and it has a lot to do with their culture, whatever you think, our cultures are like that. Our cultures can be male-centric cultures, and they use a lot of male words. So when we talk about, like, I'll give you an example, a policeman, for example. You say a policeman. That literally means police man, right? What about all the police women? Well, a lot of people don't even use the word police woman. They don't think about it that way, because to them, police are guys, always guys, and always have been guys. And so this is what we mean by gender neutral language, is trying to avoid, especially when you describe professions and things like that. A lot of times when I'm writing instructions or directions, I have to say, him or her, or he, she or he, things like that. A lot of times I use double pronouns. Why? Because I do not know who's going to be reading these instructions, and it's very important for me to be inclusive. So things like that. So there's a lot of gender inflections in professions and in our speech, and so being gender neutral is a good thing. Why? Because you don't really know who's listening. You don't really know always your audience. And so being appropriate and being gender neutral, you're kind of staying safe. You're not trying to create trouble, essentially. And that brings me to the final point in this chapter, essentially, is we have to learn how to adapt to different audiences. You have to be very flexible as a speaker. You have to anticipate what speaking style you should use, who you're speaking to, and your goal as a speaker is to sort of say create a connection with your audience. If there's differences between your audience and yourself, then you have to find that common ground. Find a ways to adapt your language, find a ways to adapt your demeanor, find a ways to use the kind of language that would get through. And so you have to give people affirmation, empowerment of some sort. If you're speaking in front of people with whom you disagree, or they disagree with you, then find points of affirmation, find ways to empower them in some way, and that will go a long way. So in a sense, you have to use whatever words you may use to be mindful and sensitive of gender and culture and ethnicity and religious feelings, whatever it may be, like whether you're using humor or something like that. You have to learn how to sometimes transcend those categories. Sometimes, people offend people all the time. Like comics and comedians, a lot of times they come out, well, one of their objectives is to offend everybody. But you don't always get that benefit, because that's not what you're doing. If you're delivering a speech, you have to think, you have to consider those perspectives of your crowd who's listening to you, and then communicate your message with clarity by using some of these techniques. But in doing this, so do not get caught in the trap of excluding people by using humor that is inappropriate, or slang words that are unknown or misunderstood, by using cultural references that you understand in your culture and they don't understand in their culture because they do not translate. So being not sensitive to essentially your audience, you will create a disconnect. And so these are all the factors that you want to take as you think of the issues of clarity and accuracy and trying to word your speech properly. So there's a lot of art that goes into crafting a speech, especially if you do know your audience. If you don't know your audience and you may be surprised by your audience, you may have to recraft your speech, which is another point for not writing it. Then you can make certain adaptations and be a little bit flexible with what you're saying. Maybe the example you used, don't use. Maybe use something else, or omit it altogether, because all of a sudden you realize that in this crowd, this particular example or this particular story is not going to work. In fact, it's probably going to work against you rather than for you. So these are the things that you want to basically consider. All right, so that's basically the gist of the chapter that I wanted to cover with you guys. So as we move forward, look through the next chapters, read through with me. They're not complicated chapters, and start thinking about preparing for your speeches. So that's where we're going to be. All right. Do you have